Let's address the universal question every man has asked at least once. Should you take a woman on an expensive first date? It's a valid question because there are clear trade-offs to expensive first dates. To some of you, the answer is obvious. If you have ever paid for a couple of bad first dates that went nowhere, then you know what I'm talking about. And you may be thinking, it's never worth it. But that is not always the case. An expensive date signals effort and willingness to pay, which both are attractive traits to a woman. As a result, that may increase the chances of a good outcome from the date. But an expensive first date is, well, expensive. It's not financially sustainable, nor is it financially wise for most people. And like any calculated risk, you need to weigh the risk and return ratio. I've personally gone on hundreds of dates in the past couple years. I spent $0 on dates before and I've gotten great outcomes. I've also spent hundreds of dollars on dates before and I've gotten bad outcomes. So today, I will be applying game theory to determine the optimal strategy regardless of your desired outcome. That's why in this video, I will use a payoff matrix to break down whether a man should go on an expensive first date, apply a similar analysis from the woman's perspective, and go through a flowchart of when you should and should not go on an expensive first date. To begin, we will model the problem as a one-player matrix with decision inputs and outcomes. And a quick disclaimer here, this model isn't meant to strictly follow game theory rules. It's an informal framework that applies game theory concepts based on my personal experience. The scenario is as follows. A man will decide whether or not to take a woman on a cheap date or an expensive date. That is his decision to make. The outcomes are simple. Either he achieves his desired outcome or he doesn't, whether that will be short-term or long-term. I will now provide some sample payoff values. They're meant to expose the underlying mechanics of the scenario at hand. So for expensive dates, we will have a payoff value of -1, 0 for cheap dates. A good outcome will be +2, and a bad outcome will be -0.5 to account for wasted time. For now, we will assume a 50% probability of a good outcome, regardless of the date cost. We will look into probabilities more in depth later. So the quadrants are as follows. We have an expensive date and a good outcome, which gives a +1. How this works is we take the -1 from the expensive date and we add it to the +2 from the good outcome and we get +1. So in this case, you got a good outcome, but it was expensive. Next, we have expensive and bad outcome, which is -1.5. You did not get a good outcome and it was expensive. Next, we have cheap date and a good outcome, which is a +2. You got a good outcome and it was cheap. Finally, we have a cheap date and a bad outcome, which is a -0.5. You did not get a good outcome, but it was cheap. So you just mostly wasted your time. And given that, with a 50% chance of a good outcome for both the expensive and cheap date, we can use a weighted average to get the expected payoff of each decision, which gives us -0.25 for the expensive date and +0.75 for the cheap date. This means that the expected payoff of a cheap date is higher than the expected payoff of the expensive date, given our payoff values. The optimal strategy for the man in this case is to go for the cheap date because that will give him the highest expected payoff. As I mentioned earlier, these payoff values are not strictly set. They're meant to represent relative trade-offs. In reality, these numbers will vary by the individual and will be dependent on their personal preferences. Someone may value cost a lot more than a good outcome, and vice versa. But what I have done here is I modeled how I believe a typical man would value things, and I made sure the numbers made sense. For example, I made sure to pick numbers that ensured any good outcome has a net positive payout, and any bad outcome has a net negative payout. Intuitively, we know a cheap date and a good outcome is the best scenario for most people. And on the flip side, an expensive date and a bad outcome is the worst scenario. So I made sure to pick numbers that gave payouts consistent with that logic. Now you may be wondering, but shouldn't the cost of the date influence the probabilities of the outcomes? And the answer is yes. It should. In reality, the probability of a good outcome between a cheap date and an expensive date is likely not the same. It is influenced by factors such as in-person chemistry, how the actual interactions on the date went, but the only variable we're accounting for here is the cost of the date. And really, it's the only one we can actually control. So what would it look like if we considered variable probabilities based on the cost of the date? In this case, let's assume an expensive date has a 60% chance of a good outcome and a cheap date has a 40% chance of a good outcome. Here is an Excel sheet I made for easy calculations. I'll put the link in the description if you want to plug in the values yourself. So even in the scenario of a 60% chance of a good outcome for an expensive date and a 40% chance of a good outcome for a cheap date, the best decision is still a cheap date. If we adjust the values at 70% versus 30% good outcome for expensive and cheap dates respectively, we have an equal expected payout. And it's only if I increase the odds in favor of the expensive date to 80% that it makes sense to go on an expensive date. In reality, for this calculation, it is necessary for the expensive date to be at a significantly significantly higher success rate and for the cheap date to be at a significantly lower success rate. Even if the expensive date is almost guaranteed success, if the cheap date has even a moderate level of success, the cheap date will still be better. For example, here, if I plug in 99% success rate for the expensive date, but a 60% chance success rate for the cheap date, the expected payout will still favor the cheap date. So what this is implying is that for an expensive date to be worthwhile, it needs to have a significantly higher chance of success versus a cheap date. And honestly, if you know that for sure, you also know the kind of woman that you're dealing with. It's a woman that really values you spending money on her, which is fine if that is what you're into. It is dependent on whether or not she's worth the cost. Now, what about a similar chart from the woman's perspective? We will assume that the man pays and that the expensive date is the better one, which is why we'll have it as a +1 payout value for the woman rather than a -1 in the man's case. Here are the quadrant calculations, which show that an expensive date is better than a cheap date for a woman regardless of the outcome. The probabilities are not very relevant here because they would either be neutral or they would favor the expensive date. The only exception here is if somehow the cheap dates have a higher chance of success than an expensive one. In this case, the woman still got a net positive for an expensive date with a bad outcome, but honestly, depending on her preferences and her priorities, this could have been neutral or negative. So the exact numbers will actually depend on the woman. I'm just assuming that if a woman got a nice expensive meal paid for, then it was a net benefit for her. But honestly, some people value their time a lot, and I can see this also being a net negative for the woman. It is clear here that for a woman, an expensive date is better than a cheap one, regardless of the outcomes. That's because the expected payout of the expensive date is higher than the expected payout of a cheap date. This matches what we see in the real world, where some women flat out reject cheap dates because they see it as not worth their time. For them, they are likely subconsciously registering that an expensive date has a better expected payout, which is why they only accept expensive dates. Now, so far, we've only looked at one-player matrices that plotted decisions to outcomes. But what about a two-player matrix, which is what is generally modeled in game theory discussions? The more interesting model to plot is whether the woman's intent is genuine or deceptive. By deceptive, I mean the woman is primarily interested in just getting a free meal, and by genuine, I mean the woman is taking the date seriously. If her intentions are genuine, then costs should not really matter that much, unless she is specifically looking for a generous man who has a high spending tolerance and enjoys spending money on her. If her intentions are deceptive though, she will definitely want an expensive date. The caveat here is that a woman can be genuine but also want an expensive date. That can just be their high standards, and it's up to you to determine whether or not they're worth the cost. But in this case, we will assume that a woman with genuine intentions will prioritize compatibility over financial upside. Since it is a two-player game now, we will plot payoffs for both the man and woman. Expensive plus genuine and cheap plus genuine are both Pareto optimal outcomes, meaning they are outcomes where alternatives cannot improve one player's payoff unless it is at the expense of the other. The men's best outcome is cheap plus genuine, whereas the woman's best outcome is expensive plus genuine. Women will prefer expensive dates since the payoff range for them is higher with the expensive dates than the cheap dates, and the opposite is true for men. Both players, however, prefer genuine intent or deceptive. This is consistent with our earlier findings where women generally prefer expensive dates and men generally prefer cheaper dates. However, both should be in a net positive position if the intent is genuine. So far, most of the findings suggest that men should only go on cheap dates, except when there's a significantly higher chance of a better outcome with an expensive date. So when else should men go on an expensive date? There are two other exceptions. When the man derives significant value from the expensive date himself. The other one is for when a man wants to maximize the probability of a good outcome regardless of cost. We will plot the payoff matrix for the scenario where the man gets a net positive payoff from an expensive date. We will give a +0.5 for the expensive date instead of the previous -1, and then assume 50% probability of a good outcome for simplicity. In this case, the best outcome for a man is the expensive plus good outcome scenario, with the expected payout of the expensive date being 1.25 and the cheap date being 0.75. However, it's crucial to note that surface level preference is not sufficient. The man needs to prefer expensive dates over cheap dates so much more that he gets a net positive payoff even when paid for two people and getting no good outcome. For example, if the expensive date was just a neutral 0 for the man instead of a positive 0.5, the expected payouts for the cheap and expensive dates would be the same. Now for the other exception, the man wants to maximize the chances of a good outcome and believes that even a marginally better chance is worth the extra cost. In this case, we negate the cost of the expensive date and only consider outcome payouts. Since the payouts are the same regardless of the cost, outcome percentages will now determine the best decision. In this case, even a 1% advantage for expensive dates dates in improving the probability of a good outcome means that the expensive date is worthwhile for the man. The critical blind spot in our analysis is that we don't know what the actual probabilities are. We also don't know what the actual payoff values are. After all, it is dependent on each individual's circumstances and preferences. So to better apply these concepts and to determine exactly when you should and should not go on an expensive first date, let's wrap these findings together into a flowchart. The first question here is, would you enjoy going on an expensive date even if you had to pay for two and there's no good outcome? If yes, then you should go on an expensive date. If not, then the next question is, do you think the date has a high probability of a good outcome? If so, then go on the cheap date. If you don't think the date has a high probability of a good outcome, or if you're not sure, then the final question is, do you think a more expensive date would improve the chances of a good outcome and is worth the extra cost? If no, then stick with the cheap date. If yes, go for an expensive date. In most cases, you should go for the cheap date, especially if you think the date is going to go well. You should only go on an expensive date in two scenarios. Number one, if you would still get a net benefit from going on an expensive date despite paying for two people and not getting a good outcome. Or if you think that there is a better chance of a good outcome with an expensive date and it's worth the cost to you. In the second case, you're basically dealing with a woman that wants and expects expensive dates. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there are some factors you should consider. Expensive first dates set a precedence for the rest of the interaction. If you continue seeing this woman, she will expect you to continue to spend money on her. After all, that's what you advertised to her on the first date. And if it happens to be only a one-time date, then she will be disappointed. Number two, expensive dates also put you in a more psychologically disadvantaged position because of sunk cost bias, which means you will be more invested in the expectation of a good outcome, and you will be more disappointed if it doesn't go your way. You may be inclined to continue going on expensive dates with this woman, even if you're not completely feeling it. Another thing to consider is that a cheap date can be used as a screen or a filter for genuine intentions in a woman. In our earlier model, we determined that a deceptive woman will not accept a cheap date. I'm not saying all the women that reject a cheap date are deceptive. Maybe they just have high standards for dates. But if they did happen to have deceptive intentions, then luckily you dodged a bullet. For most guys, it makes sense to go on a cheap first date, which you all already knew from the start. But now you know the game theory behind why. And just because we know not to go on an expensive first date does not mean we know exactly how much we need to spend. Don't waste money blindly. Watch my breakdown here of exactly how much you should spend on dates based off your net worth. And I'll see you all next time.